In the dry heart of Australia, under a relentless sky, digging a grave. Not for livestock, not for waste. For wool, freshly shorn premium-grade merino fleece, covered hastily with soil.
Australia has a wool problem that turned into a surprising solution. Farmers were sitting on mountains of unsold fleece while parts of their land lay barren and unable to grow anything. Then someone had an unusual idea. Bury the wool under the dead soil and see what happens.
I got my hands on 40 fleeces of sheep's wool that I put on top of the compost. Supposedly the sheep's wool contains around 10% nitrogen, so when it decomposes, it releases nitrogen and lots of other nutrients for the plants.
Months later, the results left everyone stunned. Could something as simple as sheep wool really bring dead land back to life? Australia's wool problem reaches breaking point. Australia's wool industry has always been a source of pride, but recently it faced a challenge no one saw coming. Global demand slowed down while production kept rolling, and the imbalance hit farmers hard. Wool started stacking up in sheds, sometimes hundreds of bales at a time, with nowhere to go. Shearing season kept delivering fresh fleece, yet buyers were not guaranteed, so the piles grew and the storage bills climbed. Before long, many farmers were spending more money holding onto the wool than they could ever hope to make from selling it. Producers described it as a small problem that quietly snowballed. Markets overseas were recovering at different speeds. Factories in major buying regions were operating below capacity, and shipping delays made exporting even more difficult. High-quality wool that once sold quickly remained untouched for months. Lower-grade wool was even worse, since it had fewer commercial uses. Farmers tried to keep spirits up by cracking jokes about having more wool than sheep, but the reality underneath was stressful. They were stuck with a product that looked valuable on paper, but had no clear future. That was when researchers started exploring a different angle. Instead of viewing wool only as something to be spun or woven, they examined its natural qualities. Wool is packed with nitrogen and carbon, and it holds water better than many organic materials. Scientists knew these traits made it useful for improving soil. They also knew how much of Australia struggles with poor or exhausted land, especially in dry regions. The idea of turning unwanted wool into a tool for soil restoration began as a simple, practical thought. So conversation started. What if farmers did not have to keep paying for storage? What if the unsold wool could be buried in damaged soil, where it would slowly break down and enrich the ground? It was affordable, natural, and matched perfectly with the challenges many farms were facing. For producers who had land that had not supported healthy growth in years, the concept felt worth exploring. That first conversation was the spark that pushed the experiment from a curious idea into a real solution. Test sites chosen in some of Australia's worst land. The test sites were not just ordinary farmland. These were places farmers had long given up on, patches of earth so worn out they barely even responded to rain. Locals called them dead land because the soil felt tired, powdery, and stripped of anything useful. Even weeds avoided these spots, which tells you how far gone they were. Farmers knew these areas would never bounce back on their own. The soil had almost no organic matter left, which meant it could not hold moisture for more than a moment. Water would hit the surface, slide off, and disappear down a slope, taking whatever little nutrients remained. Wind was an even bigger enemy. During the dry seasons, strong gusts would sweep across the ground and lift the top layer of soil like fine ash. Over time, erosion carved away what little hope was left. These were the exact places researchers wanted. If wool could work here, it could work anywhere. The farmers marked out plots and began preparing the land. It felt strange to treat these forgotten corners with such care, especially after years of ignoring them. They dug trenches in sections, making sure each plot had the same depth and width so the results could be properly compared later. Every trench looked like a tiny experiment waiting for its moment. The next stage would be the burial stage. Tons of wool are buried beneath the soil. The burial started early in the morning. Farmers rolled the bales into the fields and cut them open, letting the wool fall out in thick, springy piles. It looked odd to see so much wool outside the shearing sheds. and even stranger to know it would soon be buried. The farmers pulled the wool apart by hand, loosening the tight clumps so the soil could reach every strand. By the time the trenches were filled, each section of ground looked like a layered cake made of wool and earth. These trenches were deep, often more than a meter, giving the wool plenty of space to settle, breathe, and slowly break down. The goal was to create the perfect environment for microbes to feed on the keratin. The wool was light but bulky, so layering it evenly took patience. Farmers worked carefully, almost like laying insulation inside the ground. Once the wool was in place, they pushed the soil back over it, smoothing the surface until it looked like nothing unusual had happened. Then came the light watering. Not enough to flood the plots, just enough to wake up the microbes living in the soil. This tiny bit of moisture was the spark needed to begin the long process of decomposition. Farmers stepped back and watched the ground settle. Some joked about holding a funeral for the wool, but there was an honest uncertainty in the air. No one knew if the plan would work, or if they had just buried tons of product for nothing. Still, there was a quiet hopefulness. After years of staring at fields that produced nothing, this small act felt like a chance at revival. Something was happening beneath the surface, even if they could not see it yet. Microbes wake up faster than expected. What happened underground surprised everyone. Only a few weeks after the burial, the soil started behaving as if it had been given a fresh meal. The first clue came from the temperature checks. Farmers pushed long probes into the earth and noticed the readings creeping upward. Warmer soil usually means one thing: microbes are awake and busy. These tiny organisms, normally slow in poor soil, reacted quickly to the wool. Wool fibers are made of keratin, the same tough protein found in hair and nails, and it is not something that breaks down easily. Yet the microbes treated it like a challenge. As soon as moisture reached the buried wool, bacteria began attaching themselves to the fibers and releasing enzymes that slowly softened the keratin. This shift was visible in small samples pulled from the test trenches. The wool, once springy and firm, started losing its structure, almost like bread left out too long. Researchers visiting the test sites noted another sign of activity. The soil around the wool became slightly darker and more crumbly, a common effect when organic matter begins decomposing. Even farmers who had been skeptical from the start admitted the change was quicker than they expected. Some compared it to watching a slow cooker at work beneath the ground, quietly transforming the material bit by bit. The rising temperature was especially important. It showed that microbial action was strong enough to generate heat, a natural part of healthy decomposition. It was the first real sign that the experiment was moving in the right direction, and for the farmers who had buried tons of their livelihood, it brought a cautious sense of optimism. The soil begins to change structure. After the wool began breaking down, farmers noticed the trenches behaved differently whenever it rained. Instead of water sliding off the surface or vanishing into cracks, the ground actually held moisture. This created a moist pocket in the middle of the land that had been dry for years. That moisture didn't stay in one place. It slowly spread outward, softening the hard earth around the buried layers. Soil that used to crumble into dust now holds together gently when squeezed. Farmers ran their hands through it and felt a texture they hadn't felt on that land in a long time. It was looser, cooler, and more alive. Even the color shifted slightly from pale and tired to a richer, darker tone, which usually means the structure is improving. As the wool decomposed and shrank, it left behind tiny channels and gaps in the soil. These small spaces became underground pathways for air to move through. Airflow might sound like a small thing, but for soil, it is the difference between life and stagnation. Roots can only grow in soil that breathes, and microbes thrive when oxygen can reach them. For the first time in years, the ground was getting the airflow it needed to function like a healthy ecosystem. Researchers described these early changes as the soil waking up. What had been compacted, tired, and unresponsive was finally opening up again. Nutrients slowly leak into the dead land. As the buried wool kept breaking down, something almost invisible but incredibly important started happening underground. Bit by bit, the fibers released nutrients that the soil had been craving for years. Wool naturally carries nitrogen, potassium, sulfur, and a rich supply of organic carbon, and once microbes broke through the keratin, those nutrients began to leak out like a slow, steady drip. It was nothing dramatic at first, but in soil science, slow changes are often the most powerful. Nitrogen is usually the first nutrient to disappear from degraded land, so when it began bonding with the surrounding soil, the difference was noticeable. The dirt became slightly richer and more stable, holding moisture and forming better clumps instead of turning straight to dust. Potassium and carbon followed the same path, settling into the soil structure and giving it the basic building blocks needed to support plant life again. Researchers described it as watching a starved system take its first proper meal in years. The real surprise came when farmers started spotting earthworms. At first it was just one or two, then more appeared each week. These tiny creatures avoid dead land because there is nothing for them to eat or burrow through. Their return is one of the clearest natural signs that the soil is becoming healthier. Earthworms feed on nutrient-rich organic matter and help mix it deeper into the ground, creating tunnels that improve airflow and water movement. Their presence confirmed that the wool was not just decomposing, but actually restoring the soil's biological community. What had once been a lifeless patch of land was beginning to act like a living ecosystem again. Grass seeds sprout where nothing grew before. Once the soil began showing real signs of life, farmers decided it was time for the next step. They scattered native pasture seeds across the test plots, choosing hardy species already adapted to Australia's dry landscapes. Normally, these seeds would have struggled in such harsh ground, but the buried wool had already started transforming the soil from the inside out. At first, no one expected much. These plots had been written off for years, and farmers knew how stubborn dead land could be. But a few weeks later, tiny flecks of green began popping through the surface. It wasn't dramatic. It looked almost accidental, like the plants weren't sure they were allowed to be there. Yet day by day, more shoots appeared, turning once barren patches into small but promising pockets of life. The young plants were benefiting directly from the wool beneath them. As the fibers broke down, they released nutrients slowly, almost like a natural fertilizer that never dumped everything at once. The nitrogen feeding the seedlings helped them grow stronger roots, and the organic carbon improved the soil's texture, giving the roots something stable to grip. Even light rainfall made a difference because the wool acted like a sponge, holding moisture long enough for the seedlings to drink it in. Farmers who had walked over those same plots countless times were stunned. These were areas where seeds had blown across the ground for years without ever sprouting. Now, they were seeing steady growth that didn't look fragile or temporary. The plants weren't just surviving. They were settling in, anchoring themselves into soil that had finally regained enough life to support them. After 3 months, the transformation becomes visible. By the time 3 months had passed, the change across the test plots was impossible to ignore. What started as a desperate experiment had turned into a quiet but impressive turnaround. Farmers walked across the same land that once crackled under their boots and felt something different beneath their feet. The ground had given again. It felt alive. Grass didn't just grow in thin, patchy lines the way it usually does in recovering soil. Instead, thick clusters spread across the plots, weaving together into a soft green surface. In areas where the land had once been so dry it looked bleached, the new growth added color and texture that no one had expected so soon. It almost looked like the land had skipped ahead several years in its recovery. To confirm what they were seeing, researchers conducted proper soil tests. The results backed up the visual change. Moisture levels had risen noticeably, thanks to wool's ability to hold water and slow evaporation. Organic matter, which is essential for healthy soil, had increased as the wool continued to break down into valuable nutrients. Even the soil structure itself showed improvement, with better aeration and a looser texture that allowed plant roots to push deeper. Farmers who had spent years fighting with dead land couldn't believe that a natural waste product like wool had sparked such progress. They expected a few green shoots at best, not a rebounding landscape. What stood out most was how quickly it happened. 3 months is barely a blink in land rehabilitation, yet the changes looked like the result of long-term restoration work. Wool outperforms commercial fertilizer. Researchers wanted to see how wool compared to regular commercial fertilizers, so they ran a simple test. On some plots, farmers applied standard synthetic fertilizer, while on others they buried layers of wool and let nature do the rest. The results were eye-opening. The wool-enriched soil held water much better than the fertilized plots. Instead of the quick nutrient spikes chemical fertilizers cause, wool released nitrogen, potassium, and organic carbon slowly, keeping young plants nourished over time. Above ground, the differences were clear. Plants in wool plots developed deeper roots, giving them better access to water and nutrients. Grass and native pastures grew more evenly, while fertilizer-treated plots sometimes showed fast surface growth but weaker root development. Soil quality improved naturally in wool plots too. Microbial activity thrived, boosting soil structure and long-term fertility, while chemical fertilizers offered little support to these natural communities. This experiment showed that wool, often seen as waste, can outperform expensive fertilizers by working with the soil instead of forcing growth. The land attracts life again. Once the wool had broken down and the soil was no longer hard and lifeless, nature started moving back in. Tiny microorganisms that had lain dormant in the barren earth suddenly found the perfect environment to thrive. Bacteria and fungi worked hand in hand with the decomposed wool, breaking down organic matter and cycling nutrients in a way that created a healthy, living soil. Earthworms became the stars of the show. As they burrowed through the soft, nutrient-rich ground, they aerated the soil and helped mix in the organic material from the decomposed wool. Their tunnels improved drainage, which meant water reached deeper layers, giving plants the chance to grow stronger roots. Other insects, like beetles and ants, soon followed, feeding on decaying matter and helping pollinate some of the early sprouts. Birds noticed the changes quickly too. Where there had once been nothing to eat, the soil now teemed with worms, insects, and seeds sprouting from the new grass. Birds returned to feed, spreading seeds further and helping accelerate the ecosystem's recovery. The combination of birds, insects, and worms created a self-sustaining cycle that kept the land lively without human intervention. Even the smallest changes mattered. Microbes released compounds that encouraged healthy root growth. Insects helped control pests naturally, and the soil retained moisture better than before. Over a few months, the once barren plots transformed into patches of green, buzzing with life. It was clear that the wool had done more than just fertilize the land. It had set off a chain reaction that allowed the ecosystem to rebuild itself from the ground up. Farmers watching the transformation could hardly believe what they were seeing. Land that had been considered dead for years now supported a thriving community of life, all starting from the simple act of burying wool beneath the soil. Farmers begin expanding the wool burial method. Once the first trials proved successful, word traveled fast through farming communities. Farmers who had been struggling with mountains of unsold wool started asking if they could try the same technique on their own properties. For many, it was a solution to two problems at once: getting rid of excess fleece and improving land that had been left barren for years. Wool that had previously sat in storage, taking up space and losing value, suddenly had a purpose. Bales were gathered, fluffed, and buried in trenches across larger paddocks. Farmers followed the methods proven in the initial tests, covering the wool with soil, watering it lightly, and letting microbes do the work. The process was simple, cheap, and required almost no special equipment. Unlike commercial fertilizers, which needed repeated applications and careful handling, wool worked slowly and steadily, feeding the soil over time. As more farmers joined in, regional networks started sharing tips. Some found that layering wool with leftover hay or straw sped up microbial activity, while others experimented with different burial depths to maximize water retention. Each plot added new data to a growing understanding of how wool interacted with soil ecosystems. The results were encouraging. Land that had once produced little to nothing began sprouting grass, native plants, and cover crops, helping prevent erosion and restore moisture. Farmers reported that the slow nutrient release kept soil healthier for longer than chemical alternatives. Beyond the practical benefits, there was a sense of satisfaction in turning a problem into a solution. Wool that had been considered waste was now literally helping to grow the future of the farm. In a country where large areas of farmland are prone to degradation, this simple, low-cost method began gaining traction. It wasn't just an experiment anymore, it was becoming a practical tool for revitalizing soil across Australia, one bale of wool at a time. Scientists published the first findings. After months of observation, scientists finally put their data together and published the first formal findings on the wool burial trials. Their reports highlighted how wool doesn't just sit quietly in the soil, it actively improves it. As the fibers decomposed, nitrogen and carbon were released gradually, enriching the once barren ground. This steady nutrient release gave plants a much-needed boost, and the numbers told the story clearly. Areas treated with wool produced significantly more plant biomass than untreated plots. The research went beyond just counting sprouts. Soil samples showed measurable increases in organic matter, improved moisture retention, and a structure that allowed roots to penetrate more easily. In practical terms, this meant grasses and native plants could establish themselves in places that had been considered lost land for years. For arid and semi-arid regions of Australia, where soil fertility is often low and erosion a constant threat, this was particularly exciting. The scientists also noted wool's slow, sustained decomposition as a key advantage over chemical fertilizers. Synthetic options can provide a quick nutrient spike, but the effect often fades, leaving the soil no healthier than before. Wool, on the other hand, feeds the ecosystem gradually, supporting microbes, worms, and insects along the way. These small creatures play a vital role in soil health, breaking down organic matter and cycling nutrients, which creates a self-reinforcing system of growth. By documenting these effects, the researchers gave farmers a scientifically backed reason to adopt the method. It wasn't just anecdotal success. There was evidence that wool could transform poor soil into productive land over time. The study also opened the door for further research, suggesting that natural materials like wool could become an important tool in sustainable agriculture, especially in areas where traditional fertilizers are expensive, environmentally damaging, or simply ineffective. This publication marked the moment when a centuries-old byproduct found new life as a proven solution to one of Australia's persistent agricultural challenges. Thanks for watching. See you on the next one.